Good morning to those joining us from the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers from Europe. A warm welcome to this Atlantic Council event. My name is Johan Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's virtual panel discussion on what did and what didn't happen at the EU-China Summit, co-organized by the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council and the Europe Center. As our viewers will know, on July 24th, President Xi of China and President von der Leyen of the European Commission convened for the annual government meetings in Beijing. As our title suggests already, the main takeaway from this leaders' meeting seems to have been that it took place at all. And otherwise, each side appeared to really talk past each other and reiterate opposite positions, with President von der Leyen speaking of an inflection point in the EU-China relationship, given China's continued non-market economic practices, and calling out Beijing's continued support for Russia's war in Ukraine, and President Xi on the other side insisting that Europe's problems were not made in China. To explore what we can nevertheless learn from the summit and its aftermath, perhaps where especially the trade and investment and technology relationship between the world's second and third largest economies may develop, what we might see on each side moving forward in terms of a policy and political agenda, and how the transatlantic dynamic, the relationship between the United States and Europe, especially in light of Sunday's trade framework or political agreement between the US and the EU, might fit into all of this. We have a great panel and an excellent moderator in Dr. Melanie Hart, my colleague, Senior Director at the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council. Really looking forward to this discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Melanie, and great to be doing this with you, and look forward to the insights from our great panelists. Over to you, Melanie.
Great. Thank you, Jorn, for that introduction. We are thrilled to have today three leading China experts from Europe sitting in three different countries across the European Union to share with us their takeaways, what they see as most important and interesting coming out of the EU-China Summit, and what they expect to happen next. So I'll first introduce our three speakers, and then we'll go to each of them to get their takeaways. First, we have with us Dr. Ivana Karaskova. She's project coordinator and research fellow, as well as a China team lead at the Association for International Affairs in Prague in the Czech Republic. In 2016, she founded and has been since coordinating two international projects on China, Map Influence CE, which analyzes China and Russia's influence in Central Europe, and China Observers in Central and Eastern Europe Choice, a networking platform that brings together over 130 China researchers from 30 different countries to analyze China's activities in Europe and beyond. I'm proud to share that Choice is a partner of the Atlantic Council Global China Hub, and I've been a fan of Ivana's for at least 10 years now. From April 2023 to March 2024, Ivana worked as a special advisor to Vice President of the European Commission and Commissioner for Values and Transparency. She also consulted on the preparation of the Defense of Democracy package. We also have with us from Germany, Mr. Jörg Wuttke. He's a partner at DGA Albright Stonebridge Group, a founding member of DGA Group, and is currently based in Washington, D.C., but he's joining us from Germany, where he will, I'm sure, have the latest on the ground from how folks are viewing the summit. Before joining Albright Stonebridge Group in mid-2024, Mr. Wuttke served as the chief representative of BASF in China for 27 years, where he was responsible for guiding the company's investment strategies for China, negotiating large projects, and leading the company's government relations. Before BASF, Mr. Wuttke worked with ABB, a multinational power and automation technologies company, for 11 years on the development and financing of large projects in China, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Russia. with that background, he really brings an extraordinarily deep insight on how European companies operate in China, how they've seen that change over the past few decades, and where things are at today. We're also joined by Dr. Valbona Zanelli, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Europe Center. She is a visiting scholar for 2023 to 2024 at the Minda D. Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. She served as a professor of national security studies and chair of strategic engagements at the U.S. Department of Defense George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, where she remains an adjunct professor. She's also a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Italy. Val specializes in transatlantic relations, strategic competition, NATO, globalization, and other issues, and is a deep China expert that's watching all of this play out from Italy. So we're really lucky to have Ivana sitting in the Czech Republic, Jörg sitting in Germany, and Val sitting in Italy to share with us how they are viewing the recent EU-China summit. So I'm going to just go to each of them in turn, starting with Ivana and then Jörg and Val, just to share with us first, what are your top line takeaways? I'm sitting in Washington, so have a different view and really want to better understand and learn from you. So first, over to you, Ivana.
Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you very much, Melanie, for your kind words, and thank you very much, Atlantic Council, for having me. As was said here, Choice is a proud partner. There is just one correction, which we have to actually correct on our website. We are not a ThinkNet of 130 China analysts. We are actually a ThinkNet of 220 China analysts sitting in Central and Eastern Europe. So we just did a recount, which surprised us quite greatly. So there is a lot of expertise in Central and Eastern Europe when it comes to China. When it comes to EU-China summit, it was already said here by Yen that the miracle is that it actually happened, which gives you a bit of a perspective on how the situation actually evolved over the past couple of years, that we count as a success that the summit eventually happened. Also, given that Xi Jinping was not planning to come to Europe and Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa had to travel to Beijing to meet. Also, the summit was shortened by a day, officially as a reaction to Ursula von der Leyen's critical speech at the G7 summit, though I suspect there was not enough of the agenda actually to sustain today's summit in the first place. So the outcomes were very modest, but the expectations were even modest as well. Both sides actually framed it in one way or another as positive. China focused on win-win and emphasized it communicated to Europe that it has to behave better towards China. The European Commission statement focused on critical points which were raised with China, starting with the trade imbalance, going to China's support of Russia in its war of aggression against Ukraine, cybersecurity attacks, and last but not least, human rights issues. When it comes to human rights issues and climate change issues, which were kind of selected as the best positive outcomes of the summit, I think both represent the lowest hanging fruits, something which was expected. Human rights dialogue was held in June in Brussels. Some critiques, I would say, frame it in a way that it's a fig leaf of EU-China cooperation. China likes to see it and present it as being tough on Europe, actually pushing back against human rights allegations. European Union, on the other hand, can say that, yes, we are tough on China. We are actually holding a dialogue on human rights issues. So as I said, very modest outcomes. It was not a surprise because the systemic issues has not changed a lot. China has not changed and perhaps can't change the way it operates in the international market. Its economy is based on overproduction and export of the overproduction, and EU cannot yield on important topics either, such as the lack of reciprocity, leveling playing field, and the role China plays as the decisive enabler in the war in Ukraine. So why the summit actually happened in the first place? I think it was the signaling, which was meant for member states countries, actually saying that the European Commission still engages and still is tough on China, but it also was a signaling towards Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Ivana. And before I go to Jorg, I should mention to the audience, welcome to send your questions at askac.org. We'll get into question and answer at the end, but we'll keep an eye on them as they roll in. And if any questions pop up that are directly relevant to something that these awesome experts are covering, we'll try to weave those in as we go as well. So please send your questions to askac.org. Jorg, over to you to hear your view from Germany on the summit.
Yeah, good morning, Melanie. Thank you very much for including me.
We're having a little bit of video and audio issues. I think, Jorg, your video seems to be frozen, so we'll go to Val next and see if we can get your video and audio worked out in the meantime. So Val, over to you in Italy.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm very glad to be part of this panel. A lot was mentioned from the very beginning, the opening remarks from Jorn and also Ivana on what was to be expected or not. I believe that, I agree with both of them. There were no surprises. And I think maybe that is good news. I see that, believe that the clear and consistent message from Brussels when it comes to all the issues that Ivana laid out at the very beginning regarding China, I think having that message across the aisle being represented by the European Commission, European Council, I think that's, very important. In the speech of President Xi, many times it was mentioned the win-win cooperation. So I think it's part of the bigger going out, let's say, of China, not just related to the European Union, but also to the global South. So that is the main mantra of win-win cooperation. Although there were only calls for cooperation because there was very limited, some limited climate pledges, but I would say also that an important element of the summit, which there were some expectations from Brussels, was that there was no headway when it comes to geopolitical aspects. And when I talk about geopolitical aspects, is really what President von der Leyen had mentioned, the de facto support that China is giving to Russian war economy. So from that perspective, there were no expectations that the Chinese will back off from that support, but really we did not see anything coming out from the summit. So we had joint statement on climate change, and also the only other agreement I will point out is the fast tracking licenses on rare earth materials, which was one of the talking points, I'll say, coming from Brussels. What I would like to add here is also that I think we had a third player, which was not visible, was a silent player, was the United States. And because it was the expectations, the working on the US-EU trade deal, because everything is interconnected. The overcapacity issue that the Europeans are concerned about, it will be an additional problem now, in an absence of a trade deal. Now we have a trade deal, but also in terms of relations between China and the United States, because all the overcapacity then will be dumped into the European Union market. So that was the big concern. So from this perspective, and considering also that the trade deal was reached 2 days ago, I believe that we had a sign of, at least for the moment, transatlantic unity on the issues when it comes to China. So that will be my main takeaways. But as I pointed out, there was not much to be expected. The summit showed the deep divisions that exist, where really the European Union looks at China now as a partner, as a rival, and as a competitor, and that has not changed.
Thank you, Val. So far, both of you have mentioned the US as a silent fly on the wall, I guess, in the exchange. Jorg, over to you. It looks like your video is working, hopefully audio as well.
Okay, let's do it like that. If it's shaky, then basically you signal it and I turn the video off. My face is not that as interesting. Well, it was a heck of a week for von der Leyen. She started friendly in Japan, and partner and a friend, then ended up in China. What Josep Borrell, the former high representative, once said about these dialogues, but they are the dialogue of the deaf. So we have a bit of a tradition there that there's many monologues going on, very little of real meaningful dialogue. As Ivana and Val have already said, the only outcome was that there was some agreement on climate, and so in a way, no real commitment from the Chinese side on rare earth. There was no real commitment on Russia, of course. They made it very clear already in the meeting of High Representative Kallas and Wang Yi that there's nothing to gain. So in a way, a status quo is basically maintained, and the winner is always China. So in a way, the week ended badly for von der Leyen in Scotland, of all places, with this horrific trade deal, which is, of course, not a deal. This framework that Jörn was referring to is, of course, a bit of a shocker, given that it's 15% across the board. And so China definitely will take note of that, how weak Europe has been dealing its cards on Sunday. And that will mean that the importance of member states will be rising, and the lack of importance of the European Union as an organization will diminish even further, I'm afraid, in Beijing. So it will be tougher in the future to come across with strong sentences and strong commitments and so forth. Unfortunately, the Scotland experience has been driving home the message that yes, Europe is an economic powerhouse, but apparently not able in order to get anything out of their best partner, the United States. That will have ramifications. And but again, at the same time, you know, the Chinese importance as a market for us is diminishing. Our exports are going down. The importance of an investment location has never been that low before. There's still something between $7 and $8 or $9 billion flowing into the Chinese economy, primarily more than 50% by German companies. And in one of them, I'm sitting here at the BSF headquarters. So there will still be importance of China, but the summit as such has meant very little for business, I'm afraid. So my successor as chairman of the European Chamber, Jens Esklund, will launch the new position paper in September. And of course, the position paper is sort of the Bible of where we stand between Europe and China. I'm sure that von der Leyen has mentioned that. She met the business community in Beijing. But at the same time, you know, very little gets resolved. So the situation is as it is. China can afford to ignore the European Union. That's sort of the outcome I have.
Jörg, one follow-up question for you. Interesting that you mentioned that businesses didn't get much out of the summit, European businesses. Was there much business interest or engagement going into it? I know that reciprocity is a big issue that, you know, I've heard from European counterparts that everyone noticed that China's exports to Europe, I think, ticked up in Q2, but Europe's exports to China are either flat or down. So reciprocity is going in the wrong direction. How are businesses approaching the summit, and how is von der Leyen and team approaching businesses? And just as a counterexample, here in Washington, there has been public reporting that the White House is already engaging U.S. companies about a potential Trump-Xi summit. You know, who wants to ride on the plane? Who wants to be a part of that? You know, who has purchases or market access requests that might be interesting as part of a Trump-Xi deal. Unclear how enthusiastic companies are or what kind of asks are coming in, but it would be interesting to hear from you. Were the expectations as low on the commercial side among businesses as they were on the political side among China watchers?
I think the business community, the European business community in China is pretty realistic. They didn't expect much. I coined the word promise fatigue. We have nice speeches in Boao and in China Development Forum about China further opening up. We know exactly that means yes in some very selected areas where they need Europe. Again, when I launched this position paper, it was 960 points. Jens had to launch 1,015. And I would say on average between 5 and 8% of these issues get resolved. I made the point to von der Leyen last year, the year before I stepped down, to to actually tell Prime Minister Li Qiang to just read the book and just make it half the size, so that after the next summit it's going to be 500 points. Now let's see what Jens comes up with. The expectations on the Chinese market are also more diminished because the economy is taking a hit. The economy is peaking, if that's an English word, but at the same time, we have a situation where the Chinese companies are getting better and better, and we all meet in third markets, unlike in the US, where basically the US has kicked out the Chinese. We do meet them a lot in third markets, and again, the action of getting the dollar down by 50% versus the euro meant that as the dollar is pegged to the renminbi, that now all of a sudden the Chinese have a 50% currency advantage, courtesy to Trump, in competing against Europeans, either in China or in third markets. So in a way, it has been not good news in this respect. We still have a strong interest in European business in what I label the fitness center, the deep bench of brains and engineers and so forth. But at the same time, we have seen no commitment on rare earth. We have seen no commitment on overcapacity export to have quotas or anything like that. So in a way, I think that Europe has to really look into its toolbox and see how they respond to the too expected export tsunami that is coming there. And that is the question we all have, is how much is Brussels willing to defend European industrial interests? When it comes to the question of who is going to join Donald Trump on the trip, I was asked by the Guangdong government 4 weeks ago what I would think, who would accompany on the US side the president. And I'm sure there's a big, one or two big chemical companies with a deep interest in China. But for us, there's no tradition of von der Leyen or the Europeans traveling with business community. In October, I guess Chancellor Merz will be visiting China. I expect he will invite a German business leader. Then Macron will be visiting after that, possibly November. He definitely has French business people on the plane. He has a tradition of asking Europe if they want to join on his trip. So in a way, I guess business interest is realistically low because China is simply not in the mood of offering anything at this stage.
That's incredibly interesting and kind of telling about the offer that China has to make these days. Ivana, a question to you. Did Beijing blow it with Europe? It seems like we have this interesting pattern, it seems to me, if I think about it in a very simple way. It seems like the United States keeps creating massive openings for China to move in and take advantage of divides between the US and its allies, but somehow Beijing undermines itself and isn't able to take advantage of those divides. With the trade war playing out between the United States and Europe, I'm just back from Europe myself, and I heard a lot of frustration about US policy making it harder to align transatlantically on China, and a lot of anger toward Washington. It seems like that would have been a big opportunity for Beijing, but if I'm understanding you all correctly, it sounds like they just completely failed to take advantage of it, and instead it's hard to understand sometimes why that is. So I would just love to hear your thoughts. How have the past few months played out in EU-China relations, and what were the big opportunities Beijing had that they got wrong?
Happy to play a contrarian here. I'm still thinking about what Jörg said. I'm not an economist, so I risk that my comments would be seen as completely idiotic, but I will take the chance. I will take the risk anyway, because, as a political scientist, I can look at the other side of things, not necessarily just economic side of things. And judging by some, I'm talking now about the EU-US trade deal. Looking at some of the components or some of the sectors which were either omitted from the duties at all or with 15% duties. So we are talking about actually lowering some of the duties on automotive industry. So I would think that this is a win, but happy to be contradicted on that. The same goes to semicons. The same goes to omission of some of the agriculture produce, which is dear to Poland's heart and France's heart from the duties as well. So I don't think it's that bad. It could have been better, right? If it's 10%, it would be a win. If it's 20%, I was told by some Central and Eastern European governments that would be disastrous. So 15% is tough, but I think people can live with it. So the question is whether anything better could have been expected. I'm just floating the questions here as a happy non-economist among the group. So when it comes to China itself, you said China blew it. Well, I can't think of a more diplomatic way how to say it. So China has a problem of understanding European Union. We as Europeans, we do have problem understanding it as well. It's one of the greatest advantages we have and disadvantages because we can't be deciphered very easily. So 27 different countries, very different governments coming from very different political background, very different historical experience, very different export orientation or protectionist tendencies and so on. But China somehow failed to see European Union as an actor itself. It has this mentality or ideological underpinning, thinking that Europe is basically a vassal of the United States. So everything is seen from the prism of the bilateral relations between China and the US. And I think that's the great mistake. Because we do see that this is a triangle. This is not a duality between the US and China only. And Europe gets frustrated, but in reality, what are European options? We had this historically a big debate between economy and security. And economy in relationship with China has been winning until, let's say, 2018. And then suddenly there was an awakening that what China is doing in Europe has security repercussions, meddling into elections, buying of critical industry, buying into critical infrastructure, and so on. So the EU started with or responded with the FDI screening mechanism, which was still then under disguise of economic policy, though it has definitely security implications. And it was also the security which prompted the EU to come up with this instrument. And then we had Hong Kong, then we had Xinjiang, then we had COVID-19, and now Ukraine. And I would argue that security trumps economy currently in Europe. And when it comes to security guarantee, whether we like it or not, it's still the US. And we don't have any other options. Until Europe is a security player, we are economic player, but not security player per se yet. So until we are not, we have to accept whatever is coming from Washington.
Thank you for that, Ivana. And, Val, both Ivana and Jorg mentioned the dynamic between leading European states and Brussels. Jorg mentioned that the German and French leaders will have their own delegations to Beijing soon. You're sitting in Italy, where Meloni is a very strong leader. And I was fascinated with how adept Rome was at navigating its exit from the BRI initiative and avoiding any pushback from China on that, keeping the pieces it wanted of the China relationship and getting rid of the ones it didn't. From where you sit, how do you see capitals looking at the outcomes of the summit and any follow-up steps? Do you expect to see Italy pushing for more market access, or is Italy as disillusioned and promise fatigue as some of the German companies?
Well, thank you very much. Melanie, I will start maybe with the last point. If Italy is disillusioned, I think the Italians were disillusioned. The government and the business community, that was one of the reasons why the Italian government decided to leave Belt and Road Initiative, because there had been no real benefits for Italy being part of that initiative. So yes, and it's been for some time now. It's not just recent. So I don't think anything will change with the deliverables of the summit in terms of the future relationship. But I would like to go back in order to connect it also with, what are the changes or what are the divisions, if there are any, inside the European capitals. I'd like to go back to one point that Ivana mentioned when she said, what does the European Union has to offer? I think the European Union has a very strong leverage to offer with China because 21% of the European imports, extra European, extra EU imports, are coming from China, 21%. And only 8% of EU exports, extra EU, are going to China. So this is a great leverage that the EU has because of the market openness that it has towards China. So that is very important. It looks like, the Europeans sometimes forget to use that in the right way. The second point would, I think Chinese were trying to play tough like they did with the United States in the trade negotiations. And so that was to be expected too. So there was no surprise there on how they tried to use back in February when the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China was visiting European capitals and trying to push this wedge in the transatlantic community, saying that we are your real partner. Look what the US is doing to you. It did not prove successful. So they kind of, tried to continue that same narrative. And that's why we did not see something more impressive coming from the Chinese when they met in the summit with the European leaders. Now, and even inside Europe, there was some warming up. There were some countries that were trying and were toying with this idea of warming up. There were countries that were talking about the comprehensive agreement between the EU and China to come back to at the negotiation table, which that was a strong don't. So that was important for, since we're talking do's and don'ts of the summit for the European Union. So there has been some attempts to warm up with China with some European capitals. But I believe that will have been a very, big mistake also short term in order to, because the main question for the Europeans is the systemic overcapacity and the unfair trade practices that China has. And that will continue. And that's not just for the European Union, that's for the United States, that's for Japan. And thank Jörg for mentioning Japan, because not many people paid attention to a very important summit that happened before the EU-China summit. And it's 25% of the global GDP. So it's not little. So I think it's our fault somehow also as scholars that we're focusing too much attention on issues that, of course, they are important, but then we are overlooking important partnerships such as the EU and Japan that are both, G7 member states. Now, to come back to your question, of course, there are some division lines inside the European Union, and really it depends on the intensity or the depth of the bilateral relationship that countries have with China. So intensity of relations in terms of trade and investment, public attitudes towards China, that's important. Only 25% of the public in the European Union sees China as a rival, and that's not the case in the United States, where the big majority sees it as a rival. And then we have a very important gap, which is the gap between the business community and the political and security community. As Jörg was mentioning, out of this $980 billion of trade last year in 2024 between China and the EU, 35% of this trade happens with between Germany and China. And then we have 6 countries that have 75% of the total of trade. 12 countries of the European Union have less than 5% of trade in this, big trade with China. So from the very beginning, you understand, where the interests are and what are the countries that are most interested in having, better relations with China. And then there's another final point, which that's why I started the conversation saying that it's good news that we have a clear and consistent message from the European Commission and European Council. So that's very important, because there's always that perpetual boundary that exists between member state governments and the European Commission. And it's not only on China issue, it's on other issues too. And sometimes that might be used for other interests of the European countries. So yeah, we might continue in the future to see countries doing more on their own in trying to open up market opportunities. The economic situation in Europe, it's not the best. So I believe that these pressures for governments in every country will continue to add more pressure. So we might see some of that, but I believe that right now I see the conclusions of the summit for the transatlantic community as very important.
Thank you for that. Jorg, on this issue of overcapacity, you all three of you have mentioned China's overcapacity being dumped into the European market, the unbalanced trade relationship, and the fact that Germany has traditionally been possibly, maybe I'm overstating things, but possibly the biggest economic beneficiary of a deeper commercial relationship with China and the strongest interest pushing against European Commission action to create barriers to that overcapacity. For example, when there was a decision being made around the level of subsidies, the level of tariffs that Europe would put on China's EVs coming into Europe, Germany was the dissenting vote, pushing not only for low tariffs, but I think no tariffs was the vote by the former German chancellor. So, are things changing in Germany? What are the latest dynamics? I think when you shared your opening comments, you mentioned it's an open question. Will Brussels do anything real about the overcapacity and reciprocity and getting to something that makes more sense for Europe on the commercial side? I heard recently from a German counterpart that, the United States has been dealing with pain from China's economic practices for years, and so has been much more aggressive and willing to take risks to push back. But that for a lot of that term, Germany was doing great and still benefiting, and it's only recently that that's actually begun to change. So what are you tracking? What are you looking for? Do you think we could see something totally new that would enable Brussels to use that leverage that Val just described? If the Europe says no to China's overcapacity, that would force Beijing to do what Ivana mentioned up top they've never been willing to do, which is to reassess their economic model. And we're constantly in Washington watching for any clue or signal that something's shifting. So I'd love to hear.
Well, as president of the European Chamber, I published a report in 2009 on overcapacity. They grew out of it because of the economic growth model they developed. I came up again in September 2016 with an overcapacity report where I warned everyone about the impact it has, also the corrosive impact on the Chinese economy. And in 2017, in March, I launched a report made in China 2025, where I warned about overcapacity in wind turbines, in solar, in EVs and batteries. Little did I foresee that actually this happened much, much faster. But the base load on overcapacity is whatever China plans ends up in overcapacity. And we have to deal with this. So in a way, we have always urged the Commission, but also the member states, in order to have a toolbox which gives us fast decision-making possibilities. An anti-dumping case doesn't swing the needle because it takes 2 or 3 years and the patient is dead once the thing is over. And we had bad experience with solar panels. So in a way, the Europeans have to face the fact that as the US market is closed, as China became currency-wise more competitive by 50% courtesy to the devaluation of the US dollar, and courtesy to the fact that also we have inflation in Europe of 2.3 or 2.4, depending on the country, more than 2%, and China has a deflation of PPI minus 3.5. So if you add all of that together, over the last 6 months, or since Trump took over, China has become 20% more competitive than it was last year, and that will show definitely in the European area. We have to face overcapacity chemicals, tremendous, and I see a lot of dumping phase in other areas coming up. And it's just incredibly low margin business. And to Ivana's point, 50% might not sound big, but if you are in a low margin environment, as the chemicals are in the car industry, 50% is pretty dire. And so in a way, I think that this 50% Europe will have a tremendous negative impact on the industrial landscape here, because we have no substitute. There is nothing that can substitute the US for us as an economic partner. We are, for example, Europe is 65% of US investors. 65% of foreign investment in the United States comes from Europe. So we are deeply embedded. Our stock is about 2.4 trillion as EU, in the United States. Our stock of investment in China is 185 billion, because you're from Texas, Melanie, I can say that Europe invests every year more in Texas than in the People's Republic of China. And so in a way, the dependency is certainly there for a couple of companies, particularly German car companies and chemicals. But the dependency is much, much stronger in the shopping centers, where we love to have these Chinese products. To Val and Ivana's point, 4 containers come from China into European Union, only 1 comes back. Yes, we do have leverage on the Chinese side, but somehow Brussels doesn't find the mechanism in order to actually use this. And they possibly have made a mistake very early on to the question, why was Hefei cancelled the second day? Hefei was cancelled because Europe dared to penalize 2 Heilongjiang-based banks because of their business structure with Russia. And China didn't like it and says, if you stop 2 Chinese banks of operating, then we're going to cancel the second day. And that was the reason why. So in a way, China has plenty of leverage, apparently. We have plenty of leverage, but maybe, as to Ivana's or Belle's point, we maybe don't know about it, or we are not conscientious of how to use that.
Thank you for that. And you've all mentioned that the other big issue was Russia. So that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's support for Russia. Can I go first to Ivana, who's sitting in the Czech Republic, and then to Val, who's sitting in Italy? What is the status of European views on China's support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I've heard different versions. You both mentioned that that was a top line issue for the European Commission going into the summit, and that they weren't satisfied with what they heard back from Beijing. I've heard 2 different things. Some China experts in Europe a few weeks ago were telling me that China, in the lead up to the summit, was telling European counterparts, just stop politicizing this Ukraine issue, which I interpret as shut up and let us do what we want to do, which would, I assume, not land well. Others have told me that in their view, Europe laid down some red lines for China's support to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and China seems to have mostly stayed within the red lines. So it's an issue, but it's not as big of an issue as it could be. I'd love to get your 2 views on that, starting with Ivana and then going to Val. I know you both work this from different angles. Val does a lot of NATO work. So I'd just love to hear both of your views on what are you seeing? How big is the China-Russia factor? And is that consistent, or does it vary a lot across the member states? First to...
As you said, it varies, but the question is how much it actually varies across member states. So for Central and Eastern Europeans, with some of the obvious outliers currently being Hungary and Slovakia, the question of Russia's war in Ukraine and also China's support as a decisive enabler is an existential question. This is basically non-negotiable. For others, being on the north part, so the Baltic states, Sweden, if we count in also the Netherlands, this is very similar. I would say less on whole of society approach, but definitely there is an understanding that clearly China is helping Russia, and the movement of the borders from Russia towards Ukraine and perhaps even endangering the eastern flank of NATO is definitely a very, very serious issue. For other states, especially the southern states, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on, this is less of a concern. So when it comes to security, security is mostly bound to migration, to issues coming actually from the southern part of the world, rather than being connected to the eastern flank of NATO. So there is this division within the EU and within the NATO. But I think there is also a huge understanding, especially after 2022 and the kind of uproar Central and Eastern Europeans started within both organizations, that if the concerns of CEE countries are not addressed, then we will face a very serious crisis in Europe and in NATO as well. So it may lead up to creating coalitions of willing, then basically diverting from joint approach of the EU and NATO. And the best European Commission can even hope for is just to provide some kind of ground for discussions. So that's a serious issue for Central and Eastern Europeans, and when it comes to existential threats, and it's also a serious issue for European Commission because it tries to hold a balance and keep European Union as one voice. I would still say that to a large extent the unity is holding, though China is trying its best to play divide and rule strategy as usual. China has been backing a lot Russia narratively, diplomatically, economically, through dual use, militarily, with the exception of lethal weapons. Otherwise, everything is there. And it's good to know that the EU has set, as you said, red lines. My perception here is that it's actually in Chinese interest to prolong the conflict in Ukraine as long as possible. So if we look at the three different scenarios of what may actually happen, if Russia loses, then China would face most likely pro-Western regime in Kremlin, because the regimes usually do not fall during the crisis; they fall after the war. So if war ends bad for Putin, he may be ousted. That may lead to disruption and so on, and China would be facing most likely an encirclement of the US or pro-Western camp, also from the north. So this is definitely not something China would like to see. So that's out of the question for Chinese. If Putin wins, then it's also quite okay for China, because that would mean most likely that Ukraine has been divided into two parts, or at least, or maybe Russia would actually be able to swallow whole Ukraine. Highly unlikely scenario, but let's work with it for a moment. What would probably that mean is that the US will reinforce its commitment to eastern flank. So the US would be occupied, not looking into Indo-Pacific, and that's a good option for China as well. And the best scenario would be a frozen conflict where China can play a peacekeeper and also investor for both sides. So if I count everything, and if I count correctly, it is in Chinese interest to have a prolonged frozen conflict, which would occupy the US, make Europe undecided, also drain resources, capacities, and so on. So it is very painful for China. It wants to, on one hand, play a decisive enabler, but on the other hand, for narrative reasons, it doesn't want to be seen as in the very same basket as a hostile power. So it's a strategic ambiguity. Yes, we support peace, but in reality, we don't. And that's something I think Central and Eastern Europeans do understand. I'm less certain when it comes to Western Europeans.
One question that we've received from the audience, I'll flag it for Ivana first in case she wants to add anything, and then go to Val, who might want to cover it when she shares her view as well in Ukraine. The question is, I think in response, Ivana, to your really great overview of China's interests, can Europe pressure China to change the perception in Beijing that prolonging the war in Ukraine is beneficial to China? Is there a way to change that calculus that it's better for Beijing if either the war keeps going on or Putin wins?
I really do not think there is a leverage we have when it comes to China, because it would be seen A, as non-credible, B, and that comes to my previous point, if there are any concessions or any offers which to be made, they should not be coming from Europe. They should be coming from the US. So A, it would not be seen as credible. B, we do not have that leverage. And C, it's not in China's interest, which is the prevailing, basically, argument out of all of these three.
Thank you for that. So Val, over to you. You know, Ivana is sitting in the Czech Republic, which is closer to the Ukrainian battlefield than Italy is. What are you seeing from your side of Europe, and how are you viewing how hot and important the Russia is on the China calculus?
Well, thank you, Melanie. I agree with Ivana that we have seen over the last 2 decades, I would say, a regionalization of security threats in Europe. It looked like there was more unity because it was a shock for the Europeans. It was a wake-up call that returned February 2022, the return of traditional war in the European continent. And I'm afraid that by, we are, we have an inflationary use of the term inflection point, because we have seen so many inflection points in Europe over the last few years. But I would say that that was an inflection point. But before that, it was COVID-19. And so the realization that globalization was not working the way that it was supposed to, all the deindustrialization and the outsourcing, that was the very first wake-up call when it comes to relations with China for the Europeans. And an important point there, since 2021, the Chinese economy has surpassed the European economy. So that is another inflection point, which is related to COVID-19, and it shows, strengths and weaknesses of each side in this, trade and economic relationship. So, and when it comes to, China and the role of China, China still calls, it does not even call it a war, it calls it a crisis. And I would say that historically and economically, China and Russia are strange bedfellows, but they have in common the anti-Western, anti-US, or anti-Western more in general narrative, and that's why they need each other in this game. So we should not also forget that China even offered the 12-point plan. There was no real plan for peace deal in Ukraine. So that was also very important, because for the Chinese, they have, interests too. So I was looking at also before the war, before the second invasion, because the invasion happened in 2014. Even before that, the Chinese were very much interested in having good economic and trade relationships with Ukraine, and they will see the reconstruction of Ukraine also as an opportunity for Chinese companies going forward. So we have to look at that too. Melanie, as you know, also part of the research with the Atlantic Council that we're looking at European policies on China, we're looking at different geopolitical trends. And one of the geopolitical trends that's very important has been really this China-Russia relations. Now, not everywhere it has the same resonation. So I would say, for example, in Italy, when you talk about China and Russia, actually some Italian politicians that have been trying to push harder sanctions on Russia, they are connecting it to China, because the Italian public sees China more as a risk, as an economic risk, and they don't look very much at Russia. So I think it has served the purpose of the narrative in some countries, also linking this, China-Russia relationship, an anti-Western narrative together. So I think that's been, very it's been important in this relationship.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. I see that we're just about at the end of the hour, so I'll ask you the same question to all three of you, starting with Jorg, and give you the opportunity as well to add any final comments. And that question is what about Europe-US something that looks like collaboration or alignment, trying to work together on China? It's interesting to me that right now, China's basically using rare earths against both of us. And, Val, you either Val, yes, it was Val who just mentioned China and Russia need each other. I still believe that the US and Europe need each other. And it's difficult right now, but the Atlantic Council is definitely committed to trying to find what are the areas where we might be able to collaborate on approaching China together. At least this week, we saw that there is no EU-China alliance that locks out the United States, and at least we have some kind of political agreement between the European Union and the Trump administration, which is probably better than none. So first to you, Jorg, and then to Ivana, and then to Val. Any final thoughts on the U.S. angle in the picture? Is Europe as annoyed with the US as it is with China these days, or is there still room for something that looks like transatlantic alignment on the China challenge? First to you.
I think the Europeans are more annoyed about the United States, frankly, because they're our ally, our friend. You know, it's hard to see how the US is pushing around the Europeans. I think there's definitely a massive need in order to cooperate on a couple of things, be it rare earths, be it overcapacity, be it steel, be it aluminum, where we should work together. And maybe there is a possibility to do something about it. It was interesting to see in Scotland that actually the kind of term that the UK has agreed upon to coordinate their China policy, they didn't say so, but in essence it was, with the United States, that didn't pop up in the EU-US agreement that basically would lead to more export controls into China and so forth. So in a way, I think European leaders are waiting to see what the summit of Xi and Donald Trump will bring in October, November, and then draw their conclusions from there. But at this stage, it's too early to tell.
Thank you. Over to you, Ivana.
I think very briefly, there is a huge mistrust in the whole triangle. Everybody is not trusting everyone. But whether the US or EU like it or not, I think their positions are still very similar. They are coming with the same level of grievances, maybe different, different shade of it, but essentially the topics are very, very similar. So despite all the unpredictabilities, I think Europe is still much closer to China than, to the US than to China, which there is some hope. But Europeans are actually waiting for the US to make the first step for getting the relationship better.
Thank you. And over to you.
Melanie, maybe I'm too optimistic, but with all the disclaimers and all the disadvantages that we can have another session on that, I think for the Europeans, I think the trade deal between the United States and European Union is a very positive step, because I have seen that always as the most important thing in order to resolving the other issues too. Without that trade deal, I think in terms of transatlantic relations, other issues would have been frozen too. So I believe it's very important. I think it's, we have seen a better relationship than 5 months ago between the United States and EU. And I'm talking political, because when it comes to people and how, Jörg was explaining, that's the most embedded, economic relationship and the strongest one, which is based on, on foreign direct investment and the transatlantic. And that's the backbone, I would say, of the transatlantic economy. I believe trade deal, a good positive step in the right direction, important to solving all of the remaining of the concerns and issues that are at the table between the transatlantic community. And the third point that I would like to mention here is that maybe, one lesson learned, not just, read, but the lesson really learned and, trying to implement it in the future for the European Union, that for the EU, the main issue is the issue of competitiveness, is the issue of bureaucracies, is the issue of increased non-tariff barriers. So we tend to talk about the 15%. Of course, it could have been lower. It could have been 10%. Some industries, will be excluded. The devil is the details. So we have to see what's coming out of that. But what most importantly is that if the mindset of doing business does not change in the European Commission, that will mean that the competitiveness of the European Union will continue to decline. And that, for me, is the main issue. And that's also one of the lessons learned, converging the transatlantic economy in terms of, standards and procedures and finding better synergies, I think will be important, not just in terms of transatlantic economy, but more importantly also within the European Union for European businesses that need more breathing room, that need more space, and need less bureaucracy in order to move forward.
Thank you for that, Val, and thank you all three of you. I learned a lot. It's great to hear different perspectives across the European Union. And it sounds like we have a few things to work on going forward, Val. Good to know that there still might be some space for something that looks like transatlantic cooperation. So thanks again, and thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thank you.